Good morning, guys. Today we're going to follow food down the digestive path. The question I want you to answer is, that leads me to be able to flex a muscle. Let's start with this toast and jam. This food is mostly carbohydrates. The wheat that the bread was made from had cells with a lot of molecules of carbohydrates. It had proteins and lipids too. All cells have a mix of different biological molecules. Carbohydrates are a mix of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are basically sugars and sugars with extra attachments. There are proteins. These are the building blocks of cells. And then there are lipids. These are the fats, oils, and waxes. Cell membranes are made from lipids. While all cells have these parts, if a cell has more of one type, it's classified into that food group. Back to my breakfast. This toast with jam. The toast itself is mostly carbohydrates. It's made from wheat. Wheat is a grain. Wheat grain is a carbohydrate. The butter part of it is made from fat. We call that a lipid. The strawberry jam is mostly sugar. We also call that a carbohydrate. But if I want to use this to flex my muscles, how will that work? I can't just rub the toast on my arm. Step one, the mouth. When food enters the mouth, the salivary glands are working. The salivary glands make your spit. That saliva softens the food and starts to get it into a nice squishy bunch. That saliva also has an enzyme called amylase that starts breaking down those carbohydrates into simple sugars. Your teeth are going to grind the food into smaller and smaller bits. Your esophagus is the next step. That's the tube that's going to transport from your mouth down to your stomach. The stomach really is an acid pit. Inside here you've got hydrochloric acid, which is really good at destroying bacteria that might have been on your food and breaking down your food into smaller and smaller parts. It has an enzyme called pepsin that's really good at breaking down proteins into their smaller components. When proteins were assembled, they were a string of amino acids that were put together, and the pepsin is going to take apart those pieces as it dissolves the protein in the stomach acid. The ribosome was the part of the cell that initially put that protein together, and the pepsin in the stomach is what's taking that protein apart. After the stomach, we move to, no, not this one, we're going to the small intestine. The small intestine. Small does not mean that it is a small organ. Small means that it is skinny, tiny little tubes. This thing, if you were to stretch it out, would be about 20 feet long. This thing has a lot of surface area for processing your food. Small intestine is where the nutrients are absorbed out of your food. More breaking down of your food into smaller and smaller pieces. But along the way, this is what is actually absorbing the nutrients. This is where the circulatory system finally makes contact with the digestive system and is sending those particles of nutrients out to the rest of the body. The small intestine contains something called bile. Bile breaks down lipids like fats and oils into smaller and smaller droplets. There are other enzymes in here too. Lactase is the enzyme that breaks down the lactose sugar from your milk into smaller pieces. Trypsin is another enzyme that breaks down proteins. As the food travels through the small intestine and it's broken into smaller and smaller pieces, it's passing so close by blood vessels that the nutrients will actually transport through those cell walls into the blood and be transported through the rest of the body. It's the same process of diffusion by osmosis that we've looked at before. Remember how the tea diffuses across the membrane? If there's more tea on one side than there is on the other, it will try to spread out until it is a balance. It's going to diffuse to the side that doesn't have any. The same thing happens with nutrients. Some things are too big to travel across the membrane, and some things need some help traveling across the membrane. Imagine our tea bag is the small intestine, and it has a bunch of nutrients in there. That's the tea. The tea needs to get out. It's going to pass right by this hot water, which is going to represent our blood, and it's going to diffuse from the intestine into the hot water. Diffuse from the intestine into the bloodstream. Step 5 is the large intestine. It travels up and over and all the way back down. This is after the food has had all of the nutrients taken out of it. Everything the body thinks that it can use has been taken out of it, and it's just a bunch of waste. But it's got a lot of water in there. It's got a lot of fiber in there. It's got a lot of dead cells in there. Things that we can't use, but it's going to take out the water. Maybe we could still use that water. Maybe we can get rid of that water. So it's going to squish it and absorb out as much water as it can can as it travels through the large intestine. There's also a lot of bacteria in the large intestine. The bacteria are going to find things in our waste that we can't use, but they can use. When most of the water is removed, the waste is squished together and pushed out through the anus.
But wait, you said we were going to learn about how to get our muscles moving.
Oh yeah. Step number 7. Remember when the nutrients in the small intestine were absorbed into the bloodstream? Well, those nutrients are now going to travel throughout the body, going to every cell. There are lots of nutrients floating around in here. Let's focus on a molecule called glucose. It's a sugar. Once it gets to a muscle cell in your arm, it diffuses across the cell membrane from the blood into the cell itself. Step 9. The glucose molecule gets picked up by a mitochondria inside the muscle cell. And that mitochondria is going to use that glucose in the process of cellular respiration to turn that glucose into a molecule of energy storage packet called ATP. Step number 10, the ATP molecule is going to go to a myosin fiber, a myosin protein that's inside the muscle cell that will make that muscle cell contract, but it has to have energy to make that muscle cell contract. So it has to use the ATP that it got from the glucose, that it got from the bloodstream, that came from the small intestine that had finished breaking down all of the food from my breakfast.